I've known for months, whenever I had to send in the manuscript to Jonathan, I've known for months what I was going to say today. What I did not know is how I was going to say it. And there's a lot of different ways that you can say the same thing and hopefully accomplish different results. And even this morning, I still didn't quite know. I'm staying with my mom and dad out on Chicken Creek Road. That's our family farm. Technically, it's only been in our family since the 60s, but we found out that our family goes back all the way to the 1800s to that little plot of land out there. And I'm staying with them, and it's an interesting location for today because you go 1 mile past their house on Chicken Creek Road and you'll run into Short School Road. And right there on Short School Road, sitting up on top of the hill, is the first house that my wife and I purchased not even 6 months or so after we got married. And I took Mom to work today, and whenever I come home, I always ride around. And, I go by where my grandparents live, my grandmother lived, and just kind of memory lane. And today I decided to go down Short School and go by the old house that we lived in. My son celebrated his first birthday while we lived in that house. He had his first Christmas while we lived in that house. So it's got a lot of special memories. And the reason I say God's always on time, because looking at that house this morning, everything came into focus as to how I was going to say what I was going to say today. We're going to talk about good stuff, I promise. But we're going to take the long way around to get there, so bear with me. It was June of 1996, on a Sunday afternoon, that my marriage almost ended. And when I say almost ended, I don't mean in the sense of, well, we were young, married, and those are tough times. The early days of the heart. I mean it in the sense of literally, it was within the turning of an ignition key, from that being the end of it. It hadn't even hardly gotten off the ground yet. We hadn't even been married for 2 years yet. It's ironic, it was on a Sunday, and I'll spare you the gory details, but it was a bad day. And at one point in the afternoon, my wife said, "I don't want you here anymore. I want you to leave." And she didn't mean you need to go to Mama's house and cool off. She didn't mean you need to take a walk around the neighborhood. She meant, I don't want you here anymore. Now, that may make her sound like the bad guy, but let me tell you something. In her defense, it's hard to be married to somebody who's drunk every day. It's hard to keep a marriage relationship when it's underwater. And if I'm going to be completely honest, she was the only one in the house brave enough to say what we were both thinking. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to leave. I just didn't have the guts, I guess you could say, to say it out loud. But she did. And so I walked out the door. The plan was this. I was going to leave and I would come back the next day while she's at work, and I'd get all my stuff and figure out the game plan. But I went out and I sat down in the car, put the key in the ignition, and this is another one of those things I guess you look back on, you think, God's always right on time. I was raised in these pews. And I was raised in a church and in a home that taught me that what God joins together, man does not have the authority to separate. He doesn't have the right to do it. God joined it together. It's meant to stay together. I was raised, and it's amazing how things like that you've ignored for years. In my case, it had been about 5 years since my wife was not a Christian at the time. I was not following Jesus at the time. But all of that teaching and all of that upbringing and all the things that I'd been taught, it all came to a head right there in that moment, and I could not turn the key. I don't mean physically it was impossible. I just mean I didn't have the heart to turn the key. Because I knew starting the engine meant my marriage was over. And I couldn't do it. And so for about 5 hours, I sat in that car. And I cried, and I screamed, and I begged, and I raged, and I said everything that this stuff that was all built up, and I didn't know what else to do, and so it just like a dam, it all burst, and it all came. And sitting in it, if anybody had driven by, they would have thought I was absolutely insane, sitting in this car all by myself for hours, just yelling at nothing. Eventually, all that emotion just drained out. And after dark, after Jade had already gone to bed, and the stars are out shining. I mean, you can see these things vividly in your mind even still. And I'm sitting on the deck. I'd gotten out of the car and I sat on the deck. I was going to wait till I knew they were asleep. Then I was going to come in and slip on the couch or something like that. And I sat on that deck and I just looked up at the stars. And I was exhausted, but I had clarity. And the clarity was this: the last time I remember really being happy, the last time that I enjoyed being alive, that I liked my life, was when I was a faithful Christian. And so I sat there on that deck and I asked God, please help me fix this. I don't want a divorce. I don't want my marriage to end. That was on a Sunday. On a Wednesday night, I was sitting, Paul, right about where you are. Paul was teaching class. And the invitation was extended. And I was so nervous. Just anxious, anxiety, because I knew what I was going to do. Nobody else knew what I was going to do. I'm sure they were shocked to see me in the assembly on a Wednesday night of all things. The invitation was extended, and I came down front, and I was just an emotional wreck. And I was here because I needed help. I needed healing. I needed something. I knew I couldn't save my marriage on my own, but I wanted to. And so I made a commitment that night, sitting right there, that I was going to dedicate my life to God. I knew what was wrong with my marriage. The reason my marriage was broken was because I was broken. The reason my marriage was failing is because my faith had failed. I had abandoned it. And so I knew if I would come back, if I would come back to God and commit my life to God, then everything would be okay. I could save my marriage. The second time my marriage almost ended was in the spring of 1998, 2 years later. This one caught me off guard. I didn't expect it this time. Now, the first time made total sense. You live in sin, you reap the consequences of sin. You practice sin, sin will bite you. I understood why my marriage was failing the first time. It made complete sense. But that's why I came back to God. I was fixing all that. I had fixed all that. I was committed, dedicated, and in the spring of 98, I was in my third quarter at the Memphis School of Preaching. So this one really caught me by surprise. I don't remember the day of the week on this occasion, but I do remember this. After coming home from school, it was a war zone from the time I got home until way up into the night, 11, 12 o'clock at night. I don't remember when Jade went to sleep, but I know that when she went to bed telling me, tomorrow I'm moving back to Pulaski. I'm done. After she went to bed, I went upstairs and I walked into, our bedroom was on this side, and my boys, Reese and Case. Reese was 2 at this time. Case was 6 months old if he was that old. I walked into their room and we had a glider rocker. And I sat in that glider rocker, and Reese's bed's over here and he's sound asleep. Case is in his little crib over here. And I sat and it was a replay of 2 years before in my car, except not all the yelling. I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose my family. And I don't understand why I'm losing my family, because, God, I'm doing things the right way now. I quit all that stuff. I turned my life around. I dedicated my life to you and to your church. And I even, I'm not one of these people that grew up wanting to be a preacher. I never thought about it until just one day somebody said, you ought to get up and preach a sermon. And then next thing I know, I'm in preaching school. It just happened. But even still, I'm like, well, Lord, look, I've dedicated my life to learning your word and to teaching other people. I'm giving it everything I've got. Why is this not working? I'm doing it the right way. It made sense 2 years ago. I was a heathen. Heathen marriages end at a high rate. But I'm a Christian. I'm a preacher. What's going on? When I was 19 and sitting on that porch, I knew what I needed to do then. I need to get right with God. Now I'm 22 and I'm sitting here in my house and I'm going, I don't know what to do this time. I mean, I can't get more right with God. What do I do now? I have no idea to this day. I have no clue why I did what I did. But about 3 a.m., I walked downstairs from the boys' room, got dressed, I got in my car, and I drove to Mississippi. I had a destination. About 4 a.m., I pulled into the driveway at Keith Mosier's house. I had no idea why I was there. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was going to say. It felt like the right thing to do. That's all I know to tell you. I think, and I've tried to wonder about this in years since, thinking, why did you go there? I mean, there were instructors who lived a lot closer than that, way out in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi. But I had a lot of respect for Brother Mosier's class, and I thought, I always thought he's the smartest person I know. He'll know what to do. He'll know. I'll ask him. And so I sat in his driveway till about 5 or 5:30, and I saw a light come on in the house. So I knew they were up. And I walked up to the door, knocked on his door. Miss Dorothy opened it up. I don't know if she knew who I was at that time or not, but I told her who I was, told her I need to talk with Brother Mosier. Came in, she sat me down at the kitchen table. Guys, let me tell you something. You think Brother Mosier is scary at 8:30 in the morning when he's critiquing you in chapel? Try waking him up at 5:30 and sitting at his kitchen table, you know. But listen, when you have nowhere else to turn, you'll do anything. There's no such thing as pride anymore. There's no such thing as fear anymore. You have already realized, worst case scenario, I'm losing my whole world, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't remember everything that was said at that kitchen table. I do remember he wasn't angry. He was compassionate. And I remember he told me, don't worry about coming to class today. Go home, talk to Jade, ask her if she'll come with you up to my office later today. And she did. We came up there and we went in his office. We sat down and we talked for a long time, and now there's no telling what all kind of crazy came out of our mouths while we were sitting at his desk. I do remember he told me, he said, don't come back to school today. Don't worry about coming back to school tomorrow or the rest of the week or whatever. We've got something else that needs to be taken care of right now, and it's not class, it's your family. I'll never forget this. He took out his wallet and he pulled out money and handed me cash and told me, he said, if you don't have anybody to watch the kids, bring the boys to Dorothy and I, and we'll watch them. Take this money, take your wife out on a date, and just the two of you be together. And we did. And then we set up, going forward from that, regular marriage counseling sessions. And we would come in every week or every few weeks, and we'd sit down together and we'd talk. And over the course of the next several weeks, he helped to educate us on how to save and heal our marriage. Looking back now, what he helped us understand is that I had all of the pieces on the table. I just wasn't putting them together right. See, my thinking was this: get right with God, then the marriage gets fixed. And don't we do that stuff all the time? I'm addicted to pornography. Get right with God, then I won't be addicted to pornography anymore. I'm addicted to drugs, to alcohol. Get right with God, that'll go away. I'm angry. I'm violent in my temper. I was raised in an abusive home. Get right with God, and then I'll just have this peace, and I'll never be mad again. See, that's how we think. If I get right with God, everything magically gets fixed. What I didn't understand was this. I was trying to give glory to God thinking that that was going to fix my marriage. What Brother Mosier helped us understand was this. One of the ways that you as a Christian are going to give glory to God is by strengthening your marriage. It's not the byproduct of glorifying God. It is the means through which you will glorify God. So if you want to glorify God, what does God want you to do? God wants you to strengthen your marriage. Now, I learned starting then that my relationship with God should permeate every relationship I have in life. Why do you get up and go in and do a job that you really don't like, working for a person maybe who's a jerk, or for a corporation that could care less about what you do? Why do you? Because I need a paycheck and I got to pay the rent, right? No. You do it because you're doing it to glorify God. What we do for Him. Why do we say? Do we do it as men pleasers with eye service? You know what that means? Do you do your job because somebody's watching? You'll get in trouble if you don't. Do you do your job just so you'll get Employee of the Month? No, you do it because you're a Christian who tries to glorify God in everything in your life. Why do you try to bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? Because you glorify God by doing that. Why do you show love and compassion to those who view you as an enemy? Because you glorify God by doing that. What Brother Mosier helped us understand was if you want to glorify God, the way you do it is by focusing on this relationship. Strengthen the marriage for His glory, to His glory. Now, how do we do that specifically? By the way, I didn't tell you all that story to air my dirty laundry. I told you for this reason. I know from personal experience. You can think and you can try to do everything the right way. Faithful Christian, preacher student, whatever you want to say. And your life can still be falling apart. I told you what I told you in the event that there might be somebody in here right now that is in that turmoil and thinks, I can't make it, I can't do it anymore, I don't know the way out, I don't know the answers, I don't know where else to turn. I wanted you to know that there's a lot more people probably who find themselves in those situations than there are those who don't. And I want you to know there's a way through it. And I hope today is just a little bit of helping you to know how to get through that. I want to ask you to open your Bibles up to 1 Peter chapter 3. We're going to look at that for just a few minutes. And I want our study today to be built upon this foundation. My relationship with God should affect every relationship in my life, and that certainly, of course, includes my marriage. I glorify God with my life. I can glorify God by strengthening my marriage. Don't think if I get right with God, then my marriage will be fixed. No, think I'm right with God, and now I'm going to glorify Him by working on this based upon what He's told me, by implementing in my relationship, in my marriage, the things that He has told me about marriage, about what He desires for the home, about His design for the home, and by living that out. Hold your thought there and go back to Matthew 5 and what Jesus said. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works, but glorify your Father which is in heaven. It's through the living of your life, the practicing of the wisdom of Scripture, by putting it into practice in your life. That's how God receives glory. I'm a reflection of His wisdom. I'm a demonstration of His truth. And so as it pertains to my marriage, if I want to glorify God, I do that by living His truth in my marriage. And when I do that, He receives the glory. But now, how do we specifically do that? First point I hope that you'll remember is simply this. If you're going to be married, one of the things that God intends for you to do is for you to seek to understand one another. Men and women are different, and that's the biggest understatement you'll hear made all day today. You know, the funny thing is, really, we're not as different as we think. Neuropsychologists tell us that when you look at brain charts and you overlap them, men and women are about 90% the same in our brain function. There's about 10% difference. But man, that 10%, now that's where the fun starts, is in that 10% difference. Men and women are different. And that's a good thing. Because typically the differences between us have a tendency to fill in the deficiencies that we have in one another. An area where you are weak, your spouse is strong. An area where your spouse is weak, typically you are strong. Men and women and our differences oftentimes complement one another and create a better situation all around by strengthening one another. But that's also the seeds for tremendous conflict. If you're going to glorify God in your marriage, you're going to have to make a commitment that I'm going to seek to understand this person that I'm married to. One of the more peculiar but absolutely brilliant laws in the Old Covenant, Deuteronomy 24 and verse number 5, when a man takes a wife, 1 year honeymoon basically. Now to us that sounds crazy, right? You can't do that. Well, in their understanding and in God's wisdom, it went like this. He has a year, I think the King James says to make his wife cheerful. I think the word means to rejoice with. The idea is this: he has a year of his life. They're not going to send him away to battle. And they're not going to send him away to work. Now, that doesn't mean he's not going to work at all during that year. It just means his duties are not going to require him to be taken away from his spouse for a year. I think it's pretty obvious the reason why God gives this. There needs to be a focusing on building this relationship. The most important part of anything you build is always the foundation. It's only as sturdy as the foundation is. And the beginning of a marriage is literally the foundation of our home, our future, our children, our faith. Everything is going to be built upon it. God said, I want my people to make sure that when they married, they take time to get it right, to build on that good foundation. Now, what began in this commandment in the Old Testament, we see come to fruition in 1 Peter chapter 3. If you're there with me, there's a lot that I'd like to say in this chapter. I just want to focus, though, really on one passage to emphasize the importance of committing to understanding your spouse. Verse number 7, likewise ye husbands. Now if you want to know what the likewise reference is, he's just been talking about how a believing wife can influence her unbelieving husband for Christ. And it wasn't through leaving, and it wasn't through being defiant, it wasn't through this. He tells her to use her natural gifts, her natural ability, her natural beauty, her natural disposition, and one of humility and submission to win the husband over through her devotion to Christ as demonstrated by how she treats her husband. Now, he says, likewise, husbands, in the same fashion, there's a way that you, through this humble, submissive reverence, can also reach your wife. I don't know if he means believing husbands to unbelieving wives or not, but I do know this. The principle of 1 Peter 3 applies whether you're a believing spouse, or unbelieving, or whatever. Truth is truth no matter where you apply it. And he says, husbands, dwell with them. The them there, of course, is the wife. Dwell with them according to knowledge. You probably don't know it, but you are looking right now at one of the world's foremost experts on New Orleans. Now that sounds strange for a Tennessean, right? It's a long story. I don't have time to tell today. My family says my husband doesn't love New Orleans. He has an obsession with it. I do. I love New Orleans. In my spare time, you'll find me reading books about the history, about the food, the music, the culture, about the names of the streets. One of my elders was laughing at me the other day because I got a book in my office that tells about how all these bizarre streets in New Orleans got their names. Tchoupitoulas, Burgundy, Calliope, Frenchman, Desire, Good Children. That stuff fascinates me, and I read everything that I can about it. I watch everything on television I can about it. I study all about it because I love it. Peter says, you want to show God. And I don't mean show God, demonstrate to God. I mean you want to show God. You want to demonstrate God to the world, to your spouse. Dwell with your wife according to knowledge. Every preacher at some point is going to have somebody come to you, and I've never understood why people do this, and I make it a point to tell people right up front, I am not a counselor, I have no degree, I have no license, I have no formal training. All I've got is 21 years of marriage and the Scriptures as the backbone. That's all I've got. But I'll listen to you, and I'll pass on whatever help I can, and if it's above my pay grade, I'll recommend you to a good Christian counselor. But you're going to have somebody sitting across from your desk in shambles, crying, their world's broken, or maybe the husband and wife are sitting there and things aren't going well, and at some point that husband's going to say, I just don't understand why she, and then he's going to fill in the blank with something. And he's meaning it sincerely. I don't understand why my wife buys towels that we can't use. I don't understand why my wife gets soap that you don't use to wash your hands with. I don't know why my wife puts bowls of plastic fruit on our table that we can't eat. That makes no sense to me. I don't understand it. That's okay. It's okay. You don't understand it. Learn. Get to know her. Study your wife. Become an expert in her. Ask her questions. Ask her opinion. Ask about her feelings. Now, guys, this is where we get in that realm typically, and things are uncomfortable. But listen, you don't have the choice of being uncomfortable here. God is telling you, you want to glorify me, dwell with your wife according to knowledge. Know her, understand her, become an expert in her. She's where you devote your energy and your focus and attention. Now, why? Dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife. Boy, I could talk all day on that part, but we'll touch on it in Ephesians 5. Giving honor to your wife. Place value upon her, in other words. Treat her like what she is, which is priceless and precious. Now, we could say all the same thing in principle, wife to husband as well. Giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life. I've read a lot of commentators and heard a lot of people explain this kind of peculiar phrase about the weaker vessel and what does that mean and all that. Well, let me tell you something. I don't need a theologian to explain this to me, because a good friend of mine and brother in Christ lives up in Mount Juliet, Tennessee now, by the name of Kim Yop. Kim is not a preacher, but he preached for us one time at Fairview, and this was the text that he preached. And he illustrated what this passage means better than anything I've ever seen before. He brought into the pulpit with him, I think it was like a little tea kettle. It was made out of glass or china or porcelain. It was fragile and it was expensive. And he tells the story about how it belonged to his mother. His mother is deceased, and how this is his most prized possession that he has of what his mother left behind. And then he did the craziest thing. He walked out of the pulpit and handed it to somebody on the front row and said, I want everybody in here to hold this and look at it. And he wanted it passed through the auditorium. And that's what people would look at it, and they'd pass it to the next person. And that thing, and he's telling us the story, and he's talking about how valuable it is, and it's priceless because you can't replace it. And it's very delicate. You know how that little glass stuff that sits out is? It's very easy to break. And I loved watching the mothers when their little ones got a hold of it. No. Let me take that. Everybody handled it with so much care, and they were very careful to pass it off to the next person. And Kim said, that's what this verse means. She is your most precious and priceless possession. Treat her like the treasure she is. Handle her with tenderness and value, because you realize her value. and because you know you can't replace her. Treat her like that. Now, if that's not enough for you, let me give you a spiritual reason to do that. The very last thing Peter says in this passage is, do these things so that your prayers be not hindered. The word hindered there literally means to be cut down. Think about in the old days, remember we talked on the telephone and had the cord? Talking to somebody walked up and they snipped it with scissors, well, the conversation's over. Lost the connection. He says there's a spiritual connection between you and God that is demonstrated between you and your spouse. And if you don't do these things, if you don't have this relationship with your spouse, if you don't maintain that connection, that value, that knowledge with her, who is right there beside you, who you wake up with every morning, who you look in the eye, who you exchange words with, if you can't do that with her, how in the world do you think you're going to maintain that with him? You glorify God through your spouse oftentimes. You want to glorify God, seek to understand one another. If you don't understand why your spouse is the way they are, ask them to explain it and listen. Now flip over to Ephesians chapter 5. Seek to understand one another. And then once you understand one another, commit to meeting one another's needs. When you start to get to know your spouse, you're going to learn some interesting things about them. You're going to learn that things that you are convinced, that you truly believe give them joy and happiness, actually may be things that aggravate them. You ever read the book, The 5 Love Languages? If you're married and you haven't read it, you ought to, because it'll give you maybe an understanding that you would have never stumbled across on your own. The premise of the book is this: if I speak English and you speak Chinese, we can't talk to each other. We can get really, really loud and we still don't understand each other. We can get very emphatic. We can say a lot of words. We can use all these gestures. But if I don't speak your language and you don't speak my language, we can't understand one another. But if we learn to speak the other person's language, Brother Mosher's got a great illustration about, was it your dog that likes cheese? And if I could just speak dog, you know. The book about love languages teaches us that people have different needs in a relationship. Yes, men and women may have many needs that they share in common, but they'll also have needs that are unique to them. For example, maybe you're the kind of person that needs somebody to look you in the eye every day and say, "I love you." And maybe the other ones are the kind of person that thinks, "Well, I don't have to say it, I show it. I go to work, I provide for us, I do whatever you need me to do. Why do you need me to say it?" And the whole point of the book is simply this: understand what your spouse's love language is and speak that language. Now, we have a tendency to speak the language that's natural to us. For example, if you're a person who needs to be told, "I love you," guess what you probably do all the time to the people you love? You're constantly telling them, "I love you. I love you, means so much to me." And you think, this is great, right? This is what you do. The only problem is that's not their love language. And you probably drive them crazy. "Why you always, I know you love me." Maybe their love language is acts of service. You know, I learned a long time ago from reading that book that my wife gets far more love from me if I wash her car than if I wrote her a poem that would be published in a book. And I used to do that. I'd write these poems and she'd go, "That's nice." And I'd think, "That's nice? Are you kidding me?" But listen, it starts off funny. Then it gets to be an issue. Because after a while, you start thinking, "I'm pouring my heart out, and you don't even care." You know how many women would die for a husband to write them a love poem? Tell them how wonderful they are? And by the way, I use the Solomon method of love poems. You've read Song of Solomon. I compared her teeth to a flock of recently washed goats, and and her hair to, or recently shorn sheep and her hair to a flock of goats. That may have been the problem. No, the problem was I wasn't speaking her language. But after a while I started to resent, why don't you appreciate? I'm pouring my heart out. I'm giving everything I've got. You know what I wasn't doing? I hadn't committed to understanding my spouse, to learning what her needs were. And once I learned what her needs were, guess what? Then I could commit to meeting her needs. Not giving her what I wanted or what I thought she wanted, but really giving her what she needed. Now, the reason this gets tricky is because we typically, a lot of times, don't even know what we want. Jeremiah kind of even touched on that. Lord, I know the way of man's not in him. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. A lot of times what we think we want, what we think we need, what we think is best is completely wrong. And that's not just in spiritual matters, that carries over in relationship matters. Commit to getting to know your spouse and then make it your purpose in life to meet their needs. Now, what are those basic needs? Man, we could talk all day on that. If you're in Ephesians 5, let me reference another good book if you haven't come across it yet. The book is called Love and Respect. It's based on Ephesians 5. The concept of the book is real simple. Although men and women have a lot of needs, and although some of those needs may cross and they may share those needs, some may be unique to them and some may be unique to them, and sometimes what most men need, this man doesn't, and what most women need, this woman, despite all of that, typically speaking, in the average person, there are two great needs that have to be met. For the man, it's typically respect. For the woman, it's typically love. But guess what? Those are the same things to each person. How does my wife show me love? Respect. I mean, think about how many fights have started over respect. You ever been in school and walking down the hall and you step on somebody's sneakers? And they give you that look. And the hall grows silent. And everybody knows there's a fight fixing to break out. Why? Because you disrespected me. You bumped into me. You stepped on my shoes. Men do crazy things when they feel like they're not getting respect. You know what one of the number one reasons for men leaving a job is? It's not about money. It's not about satisfaction in their performance. It's about feeling that they're not being respected. I'm not getting the respect I deserve in the office. How does she love me? Respect. Here's the interesting thing, though. When I love her, it shows her I respect her. Like I said earlier, about 90% of us are all the same. There's about 10% of difference. Paul says it a little bit differently. Paul speaks about it through submission and love. And he says to the wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord, Ephesians 5 in verse number 22. But you know what? I have a problem with how we usually address this chapter. Have you ever gotten your neighbor's mail by mistake? You ever gone out and you check your mail and you pull it out and you go, that's not ours? What do you do when that happens? You open it up, right? Read their mail. Ooh, maybe they got a check. Let me see how much they owe the doctor. No, you would never do that. That's not your mail. It doesn't have your name on it. You put it in your neighbor's mailbox, or you take it and say, hey, I got this by mistake. You would never think to open their mail and read it. And yet we do that with this letter that Paul wrote to Ephesus. Guys, do me a favor. Go to verse number 22 and read the very first word. Wives. Who's he talking to? Not you. But boy, we love this one, don't we? We love to talk about the wives, submit yourselves. We love that one. Why? Because we're the benefactors of it, right? But here's the problem. Paul's not talking to you. He's talking to her. You let her and Paul and God work that out. Now, he wrote you something too. Drop on down just a little bit. Verse number 25. Husbands, love your wives. So he wrote something to each of us. Now, coincidentally, in verse number 21, he wrote something to all of us. Submit yourselves one to another. It's so weird how we get so tore up with this word submit. It just shows you how backwards our culture is, that we think submission is a negative thing, that it's a bad thing. Submission historically, especially biblically, is a sign of tremendous respect and love. Now, yes, can it be abused? Can I force somebody into submission? Well, of course, that's a whole different thing. But when the Bible speaks about submission, it's not. There's no negativity. There's nothing derogatory. There's nothing condescending in it. It shows reverence and love. Have you ever considered the fact that the only way you can submit is if you're already equal? If you're naturally inferior, there's no need to submit. You're already beneath. Christ submitted Himself to the Father. He told us to submit to our rulers. He told us to submit to our elders. He told us to submit to one another. He told wives to submit to husbands. He told employees to submit to bosses. Slaves submit to masters. The New Testament is built on the idea of submission. It's not a bad thing. And only a weird culture like ours makes it out into a negative. Now let's focus on verse number 25. Husbands, love your wives. You say, well, I do love her. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. I remember one time I read that passage. Listen, I've spent a lot of time studying the Bible and marriage relationships because I'd already told you my story. And I knew this was where the answers came from. And something dawned on me one day when I read that. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave Himself for it. And so I started going back and reading through the gospel accounts and looking at just how did Jesus love the church. He loved it with patience, with humility, with compassion, with sacrifice, with forgiveness, with service. I looked at the life of Jesus. How did He treat His apostles? How did He treat the disciples in general? How did He treat the people that He came to lead and to love and to save, that He had supreme authority over? All authority is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Jesus is literally the top of the food chain. But look at how He treated all of those that were supposedly in subjection to Him. And I said, that's how I glorify God. I love my wife the way He loves His church. Sacrificial, servant. We love to blame, as Christians, we love to blame culture, United States culture, for how messed up our homes and our marriages can get. And that's fair. But we need to own up to some of it too. Sometimes there is such a thing as church culture. It's not necessarily Bible, but any group of people, there are certain cultures and norms that develop in it. And one thing that we've got to understand is there are some parameters that God has given us when it comes to this marriage relationship. And He says, okay, to the wives, submit to your husbands, respect your husbands, reverence your husbands. That's how you show them you love Him. And husbands, you love your wives. How? As Christ loved the church. He nourished the church. He cherished the church. He served it. He sacrificed for it. And that's how you love your wife. That's how you respect your wife. So you do these things. And so there's our parameters. But I'm going to tell you, underneath those parameters is an awful lot of flexibility on how it works and looks in your house. And when we try to take how we practice this dynamic in our house and make it something that every household has to practice the same, we create a lot of undue problems. You know who does 90% of the cooking in my house? You know why? I'm a good cook. That's why. I studied New Orleans for a reason. I'm a good cook. That's not just the only reason. That's true, by the way, but that's not the only reason. I love to cook. It's a de-stressor for me. I come in from work and, I got all this stuff. I love to check out and just get out the knives and the spices, and all of that stress just melts away. Love to cook. I've listened to preachers make wives feel like they are not fulfilling their Christian duties if they don't do all the cooking and the cleaning, taking care of the kids. Guys, let me say something, and I hope you've heard this before, and if you haven't, I hope you don't forget it. You don't babysit your children. I've babysat for other people. I take care of my sons. I don't babysit my kids while my wife is in class. I don't babysit my kids while my wife goes out. They're my children. It's my responsibility to take care of them. And when we try to say, okay, in my house, this is how the love and respect dynamic works, so that's how it's got to be in your house, we do a great disservice. Commit to understanding your spouse. And once you understand your spouse, commit to meeting the needs of your spouse. And the last thing, I'm right at the end of my time, so we'll rush quick. Once you do that, then commit to strengthening one another. It took a long time to figure this out, but I finally realized what my mistake was. Even when I was a Christian and trying to say, I figured it. I didn't know what my mistake was. It's so obvious now, and it's almost embarrassing. I committed myself to strengthening myself. Strengthen my faith, strengthen my relationship with God, strengthen my resolve, strengthen my commitment. I was strengthening myself, but I forgot that I wasn't one, I was two who had become one. That's fine to do all that if I'm a single guy living in an apartment, but I had taken another person and joined myself to that person, and I had forgotten I have a responsibility to strengthen my partner. You want to strengthen your marriage? Strengthen the person you're married to. I was doing a great job strengthening myself. I'm studying my Bible every day. And guys, I lived up the 12-hour rule, 6 hours in class, 6 hours out of class. I kept it and then some. In fact, that was part of what was wrong with my marriage is I was so committed to my studies, I forgot that I had a wife and children. And I was making her once again. 2 years before, she was the husband, the wife, and the parent because her husband was a drunk. 2 years later, she was the husband, the wife, and the parent because her husband wasn't involved. He was so committed to strengthening himself, he wasn't strengthening his spouse. If you want to strengthen your marriage, strengthen your partner. Again, it's just biblical wisdom. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verse number 9. Two are better than one. They have a good reward for their labor. If they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. Woe to him that's alone when he falls, because he doesn't have another to help him up. Again, if two lie together, they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? If one prevail against him, two shall withstand him. There's strength in numbers. God instituted that in the garden when He creates Adam and all this beautiful creation, and He says there's one more thing that is needed here. There's one thing that's not good. He's alone. He doesn't have anyone to help him, to strengthen him. So what does He create? A help suitable, a help that is fit. He creates a helper for Adam. And He says, now you two are one. You want to strengthen your marriage? Don't just focus on self. Commit to strengthening the person that you're married to. Build them up. So often all we do is tear them down. Well, you always and you never, and if you would, all we're doing is tearing down rather than building up. Strengthen your marriage by strengthening your partner. Everybody needs somebody sometimes. Even the Lord, after His 40 days in the wilderness, angels came and they ministered unto Him. In the garden, when He's grieved and broken before His crucifixion, angels appeared and they strengthened Him. Even the Lord needed to be strengthened and built up. You better believe your spouse needs it. The last part of Ecclesiastes 4 is verse number 12. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. I don't know if this is what Solomon means, but when I read that, the thing that comes to my mind as far as marriage is this. One cord is me, one cord is my spouse, that third cord is our God. And this marriage is woven around Him. And when I serve you and love you and understand you and meet your needs and build you up and strengthen you, I'm glorifying Him. And when you do the same thing to me, you're glorifying Him. How does God get glory in that? Because we don't have enough sense to know how to do this stuff. We do these things because He taught us to do these things. We're ignorant. We're selfish. We're lazy. We're greedy. We want to satisfy self. And God says, no, that's not the way. Esteem others better than yourself. Submit to one another. Strengthen one another. Love one another. Forgive one another. See, God taught us all of this stuff. And when we live it out, when we practice it, He gets the glory because He's the author of it all. And the result is this: our needs are met, our lives are enriched, and we're strengthened. And God, who's the author of it, gets all the glory. Now, I'm going to say this. The sermon's over. I'm done. I got one more thing to say. It has nothing to do with the sermon. Thank y'all for the time. I hope something that was said today will give you some wisdom for your own marriage. If you're in a marriage that's in crisis, I hope today gives you that life vest you need to hang on a little longer and maybe save it. But now I want to say something else. Mom and Dad, thank you. Because you taught me that what God joins together, man should not take apart. And you patterned that for 18 years as I was in your house. And I think a lot of that had to do with the reason I'm still married. East Hill, thank you. You received me back. You forgave me. And you helped me to heal during those awful, tough years. You helped me save my marriage. And my wife and my son, that one that I mentioned, that little boy, they were both baptized right there. Brother Mosier, I'll never be able to thank you enough. You taught us things that we didn't know. We were young kids and we just didn't know. And you saved my marriage. And that 6-month-old that was in the crib that night, I'm sending him to you in August. Because I know you're going to take care of him. I love all y'all and I appreciate everything you've done. I've been married for 21 years. Our marriage isn't perfect, but it's good. I love my wife so much. And most of the people in this room are the reason I can say that. Thank you so much. Rise up.